Module 4, Alcohol Prohibition. The next slide will show a short history of alcohol in the United States.
For most of the nation's history, alcohol was at least as American as apple pie. The hold of the Mayflower, the ship that carried the first Puritans to Massachusetts, was filled with barrels of beer. At Valley Forge, George Washington did his best to make sure his men had half a cup of rum every day and half a cup of whiskey when the rum ran out. John Adams began each day with a tankard of hard cider. Thomas Jefferson collected fine French wines and dreamed of a day when American vineyards could match them. After Andrew Jackson's inauguration, so many drunken admirers crowded into the White House, the celebration had to be moved out onto the lawn to save the furniture. Young Abraham Lincoln sold whiskey by the barrel from his grocery store in New Salem, Illinois. Intoxicating liquor, he later remembered, was used by everybody, repudiated by nobody. A young Maryland slave named Frederick Douglass said whiskey made him feel like a president, self-assured and independent. Physicians recommended whiskey and cider and brandy and rum and beer as far better for their patients than water hauled from muddy rivers and stagnant pools. Clergymen drank, so did craftsmen and canal diggers, and the crowds of men who turned out for barn raisings and baptisms, funerals and elections, and public hangings.
It's part of ritual celebrations. It's part of being social. It's part of the gathering. And it's always been there. It just tells you something. Maybe we'll never really have an answer for why we need it. But if you look at the history, it's clear we do.
Americans routinely drank at every meal, including breakfast. In many towns, a bell rang twice a day to signal what was called grog time, so that men could stop whatever they were doing in factories and offices, mills and farm fields, to raise a jug.
In farm families in New England particularly, that there was a barrel of cider by the door, and you came in and you would have your ladle of cider. Now, this wasn't as powerful as whiskey, but, you know, it wasn't the kind of cider that we have with donuts today.
For thousands of years, human beings had been fermenting fruits and grains to create mildly intoxicating beverages. But by the 1800s, rum, whiskey, and other distilled spirits with significantly higher alcohol content had become increasingly available.
All of a sudden, you have all of these people growing grain, growing corn, growing oats, growing wheat, that can be distilled into whiskey. And so all of these rituals that had been part of the human experience, where farmers would get up and you would have beer with breakfast and beer with lunch and beer with your afternoon break and beer with dinner, but you're talking about 2% beer. But now all of a sudden people are drinking whiskey instead. And it took a while for the culture to recognize that, wait a minute, there's something really wrong here.
By 1830, the average American over 15 years of age drank the equivalent of 88 bottles of whiskey every year, 3 times as much as their 21st century descendants drink. Americans spent more money on alcohol each year than the total expenditures of the federal government. Inebriates filled the nation's poorhouses and workhouses and prisons. More and more, people began to worry that the country was becoming a nation of drunkards. And as the wages of many husbands and fathers and sons went to the grog shop, women and children became victims, mistreated, abandoned, deprived of food and shelter.
Alcohol consumption at that point was a sign of masculinity that took away masculinity. So that you drank to show that you were a man, but you get drunk and all of a sudden you can't provide for your family, you can't do your job, you become violent. There are so many references to the degradation of Saturday night. implicit that a man would go out. First of all, he would leave the home, he would go to a saloon, he would get drunk, and he would come home and do whatever he wanted. This is a time when there is no divorce, when the concept of police protection for domestic violence doesn't exist. The concept of marital rape can't be discussed. But you can discuss it through alcoholism and what alcohol does to men.
Now this is what the situation was that was leading up to the prohibition of alcohol. The social problems that were being identified as linked to it, the violence, the disruption within the family, and so forth. But alcohol prohibition was not the first activity that people tried to use to try to control alcohol. The temperance movement was an attempt by women to try to educate men regarding the harms of alcohol. The temperance movement was actually very active here in the United States, actually here in Ohio, where you had the Women's Christian Temperance Union going from city to city, saloon to saloon, trying to encourage men to stop drinking or to limit their drinking. It worked in some situations, didn't in others, but the problem was that the change couldn't be sustained. Because the women, because of the time, didn't have much control over their time, they had to go back to their home to take care of the children, take care of their husbands, and so forth. So the movement kind of petered out, and this is where the idea of legislation started to build, and you started to see a movement building to identify political leaders who would be interested in passing laws to ban alcohol within jurisdictions. It was the Anti-Saloon League that arose from the ashes of the women's temperance movement and so forth in trying to establish legislation state by state, city to city, and eventually trying to establish a constitutional amendment to ban alcohol. And through the Anti-Saloon League that politicians were eventually heavily influenced by their lobbying. And so you have many politicians in trying to become elected will start pandering, start being influenced by the Anti-Saloon League, and then the members of the Anti-Saloon League had a lot of power in influencing who will be elected. And so, over a period of time, these forces were moving, and by about 1919, that the amendment, the 18th Amendment to ban alcohol, was eventually passed by the United States government. Well, the 18th Amendment simply says that the alcohol, the sale, distribution of alcohol in the United States is effectively banned. Was actually the Volstead Act, also passed in 1919, that actually regulated alcohol and actually had the actual control over the experience of alcohol in the United States. And so some aspects of the law, as you can see here, is that made certain instances of use of alcohol illegal, others but with a number of loopholes. Loophole, you may drink intoxicating liquor in your own home or in your home with a friend when you're a bona fide guest. So they did not ban the consumption of alcohol, merely the sale and transport. So prior to the activation of the Volstead Act, you had a number of individuals, especially a number of wealthy individuals, purchasing large amounts of alcohol and storing them upon the property for their own use and for the use of their friends. And some of the other allowances that you can keep liquor in your own storage room, club locker room, in your own home, in your guest home, and so forth. So those with a lot of property were able to store a large amount of alcohol for their own use. And that they could receive a permit to move liquor when they change their residence. So if you wanted to move, you could effectively move your alcohol as well. And then there was the medical aspect. And this is where, if you're watching old movies, you hear people talk about using alcohol merely for medicinal reasons. At the time, alcohol was seen as a kind of medicine, and so you could purchase alcohol from a pharmacy, but you need a prescription from a doctor. And these are, again, a number of other loopholes in this law that allowed certain use in some cases, but limited in others. And here are some examples of things that you can't do with alcohol. You can't carry a hip flask, you can't give it as gifts, you can't take alcohol into hotels or restaurants, you cannot buy or sell formulas or recipes for homemade liquors, you can't ship liquor for beverage use, you can ship for non-beverage use or for religious purposes, but only if you receive a governmental permit. And again, you cannot store liquor in any place except your own home or any other properties that you own, storage areas. And you cannot produce alcohol of any strength of more than 1/2 of 1% in your own home. And this was a big change because one of the activities, again, in terms of preserving harvests, was to convert a lot of the excess grains, fruits, and so forth into alcohol so that it can be stored for longer periods of time, or for selling for income. Now, with that taken away, you have much fewer opportunities to utilize these excess agricultural surpluses. And then there were, again, also bans on advertisement, um, and so forth. But the significant thing, the big change, especially at that time, was the fact that, again, agricultural areas could no longer process surplus material into alcohol, either for their own use or for sale. Now we can start looking at the impact of this legislation, while also looking at unintended consequences. So, one of the major things based on this legislation was that this law really had unequal impact on society. The wealthy could afford stockpiles of alcohol in their homes and clubs, which they can share amongst themselves. But people have dinner parties and they can have wine and other liquor at their dinner parties. And the issue regarding home-produced products tend to be over 0.5% alcohol. Today, kombucha, which is a popular drink, you can purchase easily that's from 0.5 to 1% alcohol without having to show a permit. That's because how it's produced, it produces small amounts of alcohol, but not enough to warrant it being regulated as an alcoholic drink. Most beers today range from about 3% to about 5%. And today you see even beers are going from about 5 to 10%, but that's current. Current is. But at the time, this is what was available, and the current law really made it so that people could not produce any kind of alcohol at home. And this brings up perhaps the biggest unintended consequence of the legislation is the impact it's had on criminal enterprises. The rise of organized crime, bootlegging, to provide alcohol to those who couldn't afford to have access to it in any of the legal sense. Now, a major public health issue regarding the Volstead Act was that it allowed for the denaturing of alcohol to be conducted so that alcohol can then be processed, transported, free of tax or other regulation. Now, denaturing alcohol means that you add another chemical to it, primarily to make it poisonous for human consumption. And so there's a number of other kinds of alcohol that could be used to make it pretty much make it poison. The result of this, as we can see on the next slide, led to a large number of deaths during that time because people wanted alcohol, many unscrupulous individuals, in order to provide alcohol to those who wanted it, but when they do so very cheaply, would use or would sell this denatured alcohol to others who would then be subject to being poisoned. So you see a number of deaths, a number of injuries. The idea of people being blinded by alcohol is a result of people drinking denatured alcohol. So these are kind of the unintended consequences that arose from this legislation is people wanting to get around the taxes involved with having alcohol, but as a result, the use of that alcohol being transported into human consumption, resulting in a large number of health and of death and injury. Now, looking at the consumption rates of alcohol during that period, you see a decline in the consumption of alcohol. Now, whether or not you can directly link it to prohibition or just the changing of social norms, that's a question that a lot of people look to answer. But regardless of that, one of the other major effects was that a number of criminal enterprises arose, so that for the most part, people who wanted to drink were still able to access alcohol in many different ways, and many people experienced a lot of illness, injuries, and death as a result of drinking or having access to poor quality alcohol. Now the results, the unforeseen consequences, looking at this, was that because of prohibition, there was a number of businesses closed, workers lost jobs, and so forth. Governments lost tax revenue because much of the revenue that it received prior to this was through the taxation of whiskey and other alcohol. The enforcement of these laws became very expensive and pretty much became much more of a federal role and because many local jurisdictions really were not interested in enforcing the Volstead Act. Many people still wanted to drink alcohol and did, and as the documentary that we'll be talking about referred to it, it created a nation of hypocrites. That is, you had a number of people who were espousing the prohibition of alcohol. You had many politicians who were voting for and supporting prohibition who were still very interested in drinking themselves. So you had a very number of politicians who were voting dry but were still living very wet lives. Now, the repeal effort wasn't purely based on the idea of people wanting to drink alcohol when they have access to alcohol. The arguments for repeal, many of which dealt around the criminality that arose around the prohibition of alcohol and wanting to do something about that, the issues of hypocrisy that arose, the fact that you have a number of individuals who were for prohibition but were still behaviorally drinking alcohol or wet as a factor. But in 1929, you had people identified another reason, and that was the start of the Great Depression. And so then people started to see prohibition as a way to recover from the Great Depression by reinstituting the alcohol industry, which would create jobs, which will increase the tax base and help raise the country out of the Depression. So that became another argument for repeal, which occurred in 1933. And then in 1935, you have the Federal Alcohol Act, which pretty much exists to this day in terms of how the federal government regulates the sale, production, and transport of alcohol. Now, the only other attempt since then to try to control drinking in the United States was in 1984. And this is when, in order to prevent or limit drunk driving by young people, they sought to influence states or force states to raise their drinking age from 18 to 21. If they didn't, they would lose federal highway funds, and they couldn't use those funds to shore up their infrastructure. So there was a financial benefit for individuals to raise the age. And again, the purpose of this was to limit drunk driving and alcohol abuse among young people.